Kings and Generals is proud to announce that this is one of the many incredible channels that we've partnered up with for Project Ukraine. Project Ukraine is a playlist dedicated to telling the past of the Ukrainian people to aid them in the present. Your likes, shares and donations to the charity we're collaborating with will have a direct impact in aiding the most vulnerable citizens of Ukraine. We have partnered up with the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv, which was bombed by the Russian troops at the start of the invasion. Today, the foundation has transformed its projects, refocusing its resources and efforts on purchasing and delivering humanitarian aid to civilians and evacuating people from combat zones. In the first week of April, the center provided over 7,000 food baskets to patients and doctors at Kyiv hospitals, to bomb shelters in the Kyiv underground, as well as to people with disabilities and elderly people who cannot leave their homes. They also provided targeted assistance to 3,354 people, delivering specific medications, food and hygiene products on individual requests. We hope that viewers would consider donating to this noble cause and help with the humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
This video and this channel in general is maintained by my supporters on Patreon. If you like what you see, please consider joining yourself or making a one-time donation through PayPal. Your contributions maintain this project and many others in the works. Thank you for that, and now we get on with the video. There is a process in Marxism called the March of History. The idea is that from society's economic institutions, there emerge classes with competing interests. The entire concept of class struggle is an invitation to see the world from this lens.
Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in the constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes.
In practice, though, this has taken many other forms. In fact, I can't think of a moment in history where this has happened as described. Socialist revolutions have been grounded in coalitions of the working class, particular to each country's material conditions, and this was especially true in the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation, and back in the 1910s the Russian Empire, can truly be described as multinational states. From west to east, you will find a great diversity of Baltic, Hellenic, Slavic, Caucasian, Turkic, and other Asian peoples, with a lot of diversity in between. All of these groups are united in a single state, but the conditions of their cultures, societies, and geography have created very different forms of organization. Russia is a federation of provinces and territories, but also republics, led by various of its minorities. Great Russian leaders, for these reasons, have always been great unifiers. Quite often, conqueror unifiers. When thinking about the Russian Civil War, it's important to keep this fact in mind. The Russian Civil War was in fact not a confrontation between the forces of capital in the White Army and the forces of the proletariat in the Red Army, but an incredibly multivariate and even international conflict, where even random peasant armies known as Green Armies declared large agrarian lots as sovereign and went to war with Bolsheviks, Tsarists, and Germans alike. One of the key questions in that conflict was whether these nations within Russia would, or in fact should, continue to be Russian. And for most of these nations, especially in the West, the answer was and continues to be no. The further east you go in Europe, you'll find many former Russian territories that are now independent states. For Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Estonia, and Latvia, the Russian Civil War was the occasion of their wars of independence. The reasons why they sought that independence are really very simple. They didn't want to be a part of the Russian project. The Russian state and its predecessors have, historically, been some of the most repressive autocracies in history, effective at oppression if at something at all. These ethnic minorities we've mentioned have suffered greatly under policies of Russification, which were part of Russia's colonization efforts over its ever-expanding territory. This went from population transfers to ethnic cleansing. Russification is the reason why many Eastern European countries have enclaves of ethnic Russians, and also why there are 8 times more Russian Jews in Israel than in Russia itself. The Russian aristocracy was also extractive and abusive, and ran enterprises in the provinces primarily for its own capital gains. This led to a social resentment and something that the Bolsheviks, starting with Lenin himself, were keenly aware of and wanted to steer away from. They developed an entire theory around this concept of Great Russian Chauvinism as one of the evils of their society, and through various measures supported the language rights and empowerment of these minorities. However, many of these minorities favored independence. They didn't seek the self-determination proposed by the Soviet project, but self-determination, period. Some of these communities managed to break away from Russia with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, support from the German Empire, and later the Entente. We could say they dodged a bullet because many of these emancipations were repealed and reversed by Stalin in the 1930s, who later pushed the Soviet Union to double down on Russian nationalism and irredentism. One nation didn't live with the rest though, despite having an alternative to the Soviet project as well, and that was Ukraine. Anarchist Ukraine. Ukraine lies at the heart of the European plain. Historically, these territories were inhabited by nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples. Most invasions to Europe by Huns, Magyars and Mongols that came through the Great Eurasian Steppe crossed at different points through the Ukrainian Steppe that various kingdoms in Central and Eastern Europe knew as the Wild Fields. Over the centuries, this territory would be one of the many continental trade routes to Asia and the Byzantine Empire, and it would see waves of migration by Slavic and Turkic peoples around the 5th century. A lot of caravans came and went, roaming the vast fields of the richest agricultural lands in Europe. These groups became organized and confederated, their bands integrated like in medieval Europe, with peasants coming under the protection of a prince such as the Rurikid prince in Kiev. These various groups are widely called Ruthenians, and they're the ancestors of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. However, the widespread transit of nomadic peoples continued to be a feature of the territory, and so a dialectic remained between the European feud and the social organization of the nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppe. What made the proto-states that emerged from these bands unique, though, was the degree of democratization they exercised. If you are Eastern, Central, or Northern European, your language may have a word similar to Rada or Krug. It might even be the name of your parliament, or mean something similar to council or advice. Well, what that family of words traces its meaning to are the governing committees of these tribes and later free cities. That is to say, the etymology behind the Western and Eastern Slavic words for parliament is rooted in a system of election that described the social organization of steppe peoples, a root that is interestingly not shared with Southern Slavs, perhaps because they were further away from these political developments. In these tribal societies, select assemblies and sometimes the entire community would gather and elect the military leader, the judge, the treasurer, and other administrators. An aspiring chief had to argue their merit to their peers, and, though being competent was the point, what mattered most was that your community or its representatives consented to be governed. The tribes would at different times summon councils that could vote on going to war, signing peace, staffing the leadership, and even distributing farmland. In places that became consolidated and urban, such as Novgorod or Pskov, these assemblies became the Veshes, institutions similar to the freemen assemblies of German free cities. In many occasions, the city would be more loyal to the Veshe than the prince. It's important to say that this was by no means an ideal democracy. Titles were often held for life, and these councils used to only gather after the death of a title holder. Still, we could argue that more people in a proto-state with these traditions were closer to participating in their government than their contemporaries in Western Europe, where absolutism consolidated ever more against local hierarchies in villages. These unique developments, largely experienced by many different tribes, led to the emergence of the Cossacks. The Cossacks were a group of Slavic communities that rose up around the early 16th century. Their societies were organized in hosts, which were groups of large, armed, extended families where every man was a soldier. Though their exact origin is somewhat of a mystery, the fact they organized themselves by the council system of the free city, with elements of tribal democracy, might give us a clue for their origins, a unique emergence of the political mechanics of the land. Women had a curious place in Cossack society. As it's common to culturally nomadic peoples in the Eurasian steppe, to this day, things such as bride kidnapping happened a lot, especially as the lands around the Dnieper River were constantly at war, either with all the people who bordered the land or with different groups of semi-nomadic peoples, such as the Tatars, a different Turkic semi-nomadic group. However, women within a Cossack community had various rights that Western European women didn't have. Don-Cossack women could initiate divorces, have guarantees of community support if their husbands died in a war, and from the 17th century onwards they increasingly participated in the economy and even the army of the host. British women wouldn't have similar rights encoded in law until the late 19th century. The Cossacks were unique in that their society was also remarkably open. A woman who was rescued from, let's say, raiding Tatars and had half-tattered children of her own as a result, could be welcomed back in the community with them and remarry. Though they were a Slavic and Orthodox people, and very zealous in fact, these insertions and reinsertions into the tribe weren't a tough process that ran along ethnic lines. Cossack assimilation, being somewhat informed by the diversity that came with abductions and refugees, was relatively lax. This is particularly eye-catching because all of these social developments were happening while Europe was having a century of racial and interfaith bloodbaths with the Protestant Reformation. We could spend a lot of time discussing Cossack society, but what's important for us, aside this very general picture, is that these forms of social organization run in the opposite direction to the autocracy of Moscovia, the city-state that would eventually become Russia. But, as far as Ukraine is concerned, after the Mongol destruction of the Kievan Rus and the collapse of the Viking princes, the former territory had two political branches grow out of itself. A north that was increasingly consolidating an expansionist, despotic and absolutist feudalism under Mongol suzerainty and, later, the likes of Ivan the Terrible, and a south that, all things considered, was more decentralized and horizontal, with a western chunk under Lithuanian and later Polish-Lithuanian rule, and the wild fields remaining a place where rule by assembly and honor codes survived, a north where the Veshes were destroyed and the people were bound into serfdom, and a southeast where peasants escaped to break free of that serfdom. The Northern Wars is the term we use to describe the power struggles of various empires in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. They cover over 4 centuries of conflict and are beyond the scope of this video. But the one outcome that interests us from them was the massive expansion of territory controlled by Moscow and the consolidation of the Tsardom of Russia. The Cossacks played the various factions of the Northern Wars for their own benefit. They got away with it until these factions became too big and they were compelled to pick a dominant ally. The Cossacks had their own consolidation process, integrating into various larger states until the last independent group, the Zaporozhian host, had a choice to make. Its ataman, or leader, at this critical time was an enemy of Poland-Lithuania. He allied with Russia thinking they'd preserve Cossack independence, but in effect, he just replaced one group of overlords he had once rebelled against with another. After centuries of struggle, serfdom arrived to Ukraine in 1781, along with the insertion of Russian society under Catherine the Great. Many of these liberties eroded with Muscovite consolidation, as the Cossacks were further integrated into Russia as the iron fist of the Tsars, enforcing the border and guarding important security matters. They became an almost warrior caste. Cossack units performed various tasks of internal control and were an instrumental part of eastern expansion as cavalry and skirmishers in Siberia. Even then, they continued to value their independence well after the integration into Russia, and the Cossacks rebelled at various times they felt encroached. This was at least a bit disquieting to a state that wanted to continue its expansion, but had to deal with these people near one of its most critical borderlands. We could even say, the borderland. It is at this moment where modern, recognizable Ukrainian culture starts taking shape. Catherine the Great had to squash one of the largest Cossack rebellions, and that convinced her to begin the Russification of the steppes. This created a dialectic between the historical Ruthenian cultures of the land, tempered over the centuries in the crossroads of empires, and the Russian overlords that came as modernizers. Many cities and settlements in Ukraine are really ancient, but places like Odessa and Mariupol didn't really come into themselves until the Russian Empire consolidated them. A chunk of this landmass also remained in the territories of Austria-Hungary, which had its own minority of Ruthenians with ties to the west, and this western Ukraine became a hotbed for liberal and nationalist ideas. The east went a different route. With the introduction of Russian governance, Western political traditions also found their way into Ukraine, along with a very aggressive Russification. Many Russians were liberals and socialists that were also oppressed by their state, and they allied with Ukrainians, whether in communities, radical reading circles, or even uprisings such as the Decembrist Revolt. Writers such as Bakunin and Kropotkin started to formulate anarchism, in parallel to the many traditions in the West descended from the revolutions of 1848. Anarchism is a strange ideology in that it isn't primarily concerned with an ideal for society, but more a methodology to dismantle the parts of a society that are unjust. The core principle is that any authority has a burden of proof for its validity. In a liberal democracy, we validate that through the electoral system, but anarchism is way more inviting in the questions that it asks. Why stop at the vote? If a vote results in officials that are corrupt or criminal, isn't that corruption always wrong? If so, why should people wait for, let's say, political immunity to expire in order to hold a politician accountable? Wouldn't it be better, say, that any community organized itself as directly as possible? There are still many problems to go through though. There is a lot of philosophical disagreement within anarchism. For example, we still haven't formally defined injustice, which would be useful if we wanted to create guiding social principles. Just from this question alone, there emerge many different flavors of anarchism. But to get back to Russia, we'll just state that, to some degree, extreme suspicion of authority emerged from extreme abuse of authority, as opposed to Marxists, who are more positive about taking over the state and making a moral use of its institutions, which is an idea we could tie into Hegelianism. Anarchists categorically reject the use of the state, as it is a wide consensus that the state is one of these oppressive institutions. And something particularly interesting about Ukraine is that the idealization of the Cossack as a libertarian warrior peasant that rose against the Tsar every other decade never really left the public's imagination. Many Narodniks, who were anti-Tsarist Russian socialists, found in this idealized Cossack a counter-proposal to totalitarianism and encoded it into their ideology of agrarianism. Even Jews in the Pale of Settlement, a big swath of land where Russia contained its Jews, thought these ideas were attractive. Anarchism, after all, empowered local communities to govern and, more importantly, protect themselves. After years of Tsarist terror, the many anarchists of the Russian Empire began a black terror on Tsarism, where violence and sabotage to nobles and their property became widespread in the lead-up to the Russian revolutions. And this would continue throughout the late 19th century, along with an ever-consolidating Ukrainian nationalist movement. Let's resume by defining another word: Soviet. Soviet is another of these words that mean council, and in the specific context of the Russian revolutions, they mean workers' councils. Think of them as assemblies that gather delegates from various workplaces, and they regulate both an administrative division of the state and its industry. Kind of like a family of companies run by its unions, while the unions themselves also are the legislative body of a city, for example. Soviets were naturally emerging from 1905 onwards, not really related to a centralized organism of any kind. They were part of the social discontent that was challenging the authority of the Tsar and the terms with which he was industrializing Russia. From the perspective of the socialist revolutionaries, the Soviet was an amazing, but also hotly debated institution. A workers' council was, after all, the endgame of worker empowerment, but what should a workers' council look like and do? How democratic, how big, how powerful should it be? How should it be structured? These were contested issues that the general Russian left was formulating, but the conversation would, in essence, simplify to every faction competing against the ever-consolidating Bolshevik vision. Lenin was lukewarm to anarchists and pandered to them quite often, but he would withdraw much of that language as he gained increasing control of the state. The Bolsheviks came to power espousing many things that the anarchist movement would have supported. All power to the Soviets. The land belongs to the farmer, the factory to the worker. However, what materially happened was not a consolidation of these wishes as such, but a centralization of power under a socialist state, which is a Marxist perspective. Leninism was such a state project. Instead of prioritizing the growth of the organizations that had emerged from the revolution, what this system sought to do was consolidate these organizations around the government, so they could be at its service and march along in its direction. From a Leninist perspective, which is heavily Marxist, anarchism seemed unable to consolidate revolutionary gains. Anarchists were seen as individualistic to a counterproductive degree, too concerned with the bottom-up approach. The great Russian and even global mass of workers would be unable to coordinate under such a system. How would anarchists, say, fight the German army if their battalions had to be rallied from every small locality like a horde? Anarchists were thus, through their ideology, seen as saboteurs, as rusting the wheels of the revolutionary cause, slowing the advance towards communism. In taking control of the Russian state, Leninism acquired many of its institutions. With them, the communists eventually constructed a secret police called the Cheka that would be used to silence, disappear, and weaken the libertarian communist faction, as well as many opponents of the Bolsheviks. This secret police was enhanced and expanded from the skeleton of the Okhrana, the secret police of the Tsar. Many of the Russian anarchists were deported, relocated, or imprisoned, and all they could do was offer critiques to the Soviet Union from afar. Critiques that were ignored as the Russian state rebuilt and reinvented a new absolutism, one that, through various evolutions, would reshape under Stalin as a sort of Red Tsarism, you could say, though many people don't like that term. The fact remains that Trotsky and Lenin rebuilt a Russian autocracy, and they were behind the deportation of professors, the abolition of the Constituent Assembly that had emerged from an earlier revolution, and the seizure of the Free Soviets into official Soviets, supervised by a Bolshevik agent and without any of the legislative abilities they used to have. In Ukraine, though, something different happened. Prior to the revolution, 1/3 of the land was held by the crownlands and the estates of nobles and priests. These people were around 1% of the population, whereas a little more than a third held by the Ukrainian peasants composed 70% of the population. Agriculture was most of the economy, and most people did it for work or life in the context of this great inequality. At the time of the abolition of serfdom, the peasantry, through various traditions, continued to live holding land as villages as opposed to the property structure of estates. The term for that is gromada, which is the equivalent of the Russian mir, and importantly, many of these villages had pre-existing local governing councils. The Russian Revolution also was the birth date of the Ukrainian People's Republic, an independent state that was socialist and increasingly affirming itself as an empowered national community. Among many things, they began a policy of indigenization, which was a set of policies aimed to reverse decades of Russification and reconstitute the Ukrainian national identity and the Ukrainian citizen. During this period, the national flag was created and the country experimented with independence. Ukraine was nevertheless a middle theater between Russia, Imperial Germany, and Austria-Hungary, and as a country surrounded by larger powers that, at the time, were at war, it didn't take long for the borderlands to become a battleground again. Hilariously, a man of Cossack descent with questionable German support couped the government and declared himself a new Ataman of Ukraine, though he barely led a country as everything devolved into a civil war. And from this chaos, Nestor Makhno comes into the spotlight. Whereas the Russian anarchists had constant personality disputes, he was a charismatic leader that rallied people to his side. Where in Russia the agrarian and syndicalist anarchists wouldn't articulate a common platform, Ukraine's largely agrarian East was a perfect fit for agrarian anarchism. Anarchism in Ukraine, with the exception of cities like Odessa, was largely a movement of the peasants exerting control through their traditional institutions from oppressive landlords and Russian elites. More significantly, the Soviet as a free workers' council survived in Ukraine. Far away from a Moscow that was fighting itself, the decentralized structures of the Gromadas were relatively simple to adapt into socialist ideas. Makhno famously said that once the peasants grasped the concepts, they appropriated them as their own and didn't have to be directed and bossed. This free territory that came to be known as the Makhnovщina created a string of villages and communities governed by direct democracy, by referenda and self-governance, around the local committee and its confederation with other committees, even something we could call a unionized army command. How crazy does that sound? If you tie all of this into the way that the Cossacks ruled themselves and managed an analogous system for centuries, maybe not much. Makhno's leadership role is often magnified by his detractors, many of them Soviets, and people will call him the kingpin of a horde of bandits, but that's not true. Though he had a commanding role in a military sense, the Makhnovщina ran entirely by committee. Like the Zaporozhian Cossacks, they elected their commanders, their administrators, and their managers. Makhno himself never had titles or condecorations besides the effective unofficial Batko, which means father in Ukrainian, and was used along the lines of his being a first among equals. This is similar thematically to the Cossack Ataman Koshevoy, who was at least officially just a community leader, and had to accept his election with a ritual of reluctance similar to the election of the Speaker of the House of Commons, who has to be dragged by their colleagues to the chair. Though Makhno led people militarily through an organization called the Revolutionary Military Soviet, even this was a Soviet. The Black Army did not organize as a more classic European army, but more as the Cossacks themselves, not as a command chain but as a group of duelists, relying on the ability of individual fighters.
This is how the historian Mikhail Kubanin describes the tactics of the soldier of the Black Army. Whenever Red troops brought severe pressure to bear on the Mahavist army, the latter often beat in hasty retreat, striving to vanish from the enemy's field of vision, then promptly attacking his rear, having taken care to leave one unit up ahead to serve as bait for the Reds. It was through such swift, forceful, unexpected onslaughts that the Reds often found themselves beaten. Just when a Red unit thought that it had defeated the Mahavists and went to cap its success by giving chase, it often found itself in fact under attack from the rear. If that approach failed, the Mahavists, under constant pressure from the enemy, used to split their units into different groups, scattering in every direction, thereby completely disorienting the enemy. Sometimes these groups would split themselves up into regiments, regiments into sotnias, and so on down to quite tiny tactical units. By 1921, the whole of the Ukraine teamed with such Mahavist detachments, sometimes coming together into a single force, sometimes scattering themselves throughout the countryside again, and, bearing their weapons, reverting into peaceable villagers.
And in the words of Officer Efimov, a Red Army commissioner tasked with combating the Ukrainian Anarchist, this soldier also was such that, by reason of his experience of partisan warfare or of the social conditions of his existence, the Macavist is possessed of highly developed personal qualities. He feels wholly independent everywhere. Even in combat, his favorite order of cavalry attack is the lava, which affords every combatant maximum autonomy. His personal qualities as a fighting man ensure that he does not lose his head in the most dangerous moments, nor does he have to evade specific instructions. He knows what he has to do. There is no need for him to be called to order and under constant supervision.
At its peak, the Makhnovshchina managed a territory half the size of France in eastern Ukraine. Ironically enough, Ekaterinoslav, a province named after the icon of Russian absolutism, became the blossoming grounds of the Free Territory, an anarchism that succeeded mostly in the countryside, and that their various enemies couldn't completely defeat, precisely because of that. The Black Army could only be eliminated once the Bolsheviks were tying the last of the loose ends, and Trotsky's command, which at this point had recruited Tsarist generals as servants of the Bolshevik cause, could shift its attention to Ukraine. And so, history rhymed. The northern state centered around Moscow abolished the Free Soviets and integrated itself under an increasingly authoritarian dictatorship. The southern Free Territory, on the other hand, remained the place where the Workers' Council survived, and where libertarian communists escaped to at the crossroads of empires, where a warring faction fought against many for its independence until once again it couldn't do so anymore. We won't cover the campaigns of the Black Army or even too many details about the Makhnovshchina's internal affairs here. There are channels interested in the First World War that I believe might eventually make videos on it. Better videos than I could make right now too, and there certainly is room for further discussion about how Ukrainian anarchism worked that I'd love to participate in at some point. Instead, what I want to portray is something about the political conditions of Ukraine contrasting with Russia. Ukraine is not Russia. They have had different developments, different identities, and though they're obviously related by centuries of shared history and political intrigue, there are many things that are distinct, and more importantly, a Ukrainian will to be distinct. Together as they are, both countries took different paths. There was a reason why anarchism had a more successful experiment in Ukraine than in Russia, even though it was at large formulated by Russians. And we can root that in a distinct Ukrainian experience of institutions, of politics, and of history. Similarly, this experience can explain why Ukraine has had more success, or at least more willingness to experiment with liberal democracy since the 90s. And if you, like me, hope this Ukrainian experiment continues as best it can, as we should hope for the good of the people within all nations, I hope we can continue to root for their freedom and independence. Thank you for watching. This was the first video I made without drawing too much. If I said I made 20 slides, that's overly generous, and because of that I am incredibly thankful to the artists who came forward to volunteer and create illustrations. I would like to thank beacebrocess, a Palestinian-American YouTuber who runs a channel of his own covering history and politics, and a Twitch channel where he does art streams. He drew an entire segment, and if you're interested in Middle Eastern topics, you'll really like his stuff. I am very thankful to him for doing so much in so little time, and I hope you do check him out. Paxlark, an Australian YouTuber who also has his own channel and drew a segment on anarchism, he's also interested in expanding on this topic. Gascony, yet another YouTuber, this time an American with his own channel who drew about the Cossacks. June, a Korean artist who drew the segment on early Ukrainian geographical history. Mike 1917, a Dutch artist who also drew segments on the Cossacks. And Onecko, a Russian artist who not only drew around 1/6 of the video, but also helped me improve the script from its original draft. He provided a lot of commentary that helped me and many artists improve the accuracy of the things we were representing. Thank you for your wonderful contributions. Everyone has listed various social media links that you can find in the description, and they really deserve as much credit as I do. Finally, we have important mentions of people who contributed with their voices to this production. The YouTuber YUGOPNIK, who runs a political analysis channel from a leftist perspective. I'm a subscriber of his and I've really liked his videos for some time now. I listened to them quite a lot, and he was really approachable to read his segment, so thank you, comrade, for helping out. You can find a link to his channel in the description as well. And Katya, who is Ukrainian and went around her circle looking for people who could read the quotes, as she wasn't super into the idea of giving women's voices to Soviet officers. She really went above and beyond with that effort and helped me with a lot of other things, so I thank her for that. With that, I'll see you later. If you're around 5% of people who made it this deep into the video, comment Slava Ukraini and I'll give you a heart reaction. See you on the next one.